based on the president's record of not following through on any threats to increase pressure on Russia with sanctions or other measures, nothing that's said, I think, can be really counted on until we see action. I do expect that the European leaders who have turned up for this are there because they're worried that the president of the United States is going to abandon Ukraine or somehow put all the blame on Ukraine if there's not some sort of a deal. If the president were to say, Vladimir Putin, get your troops out of Ukraine, which he has never said, by the way, neither he or the Secretary of State have never said the Russians should leave Ukraine, not one time, that would be a significant shift.
General Hodges, what has been the reaction in Europe, a region where you have spent some key parts of your career? What has been the reaction in Europe among your former counterparts and others in the area to the summit on Friday, and then what we have seen unfold since?
I'd say three things. First of all, they are aghast and in disbelief that the President of the United States has treated President Putin the way he has, and that he does the Kremlin's bidding. I mean, almost verbatim on some of the talking points. That most Europeans are dumbfounded that this is what's happening after decades of American leadership in European security through NATO, but also deterring the Soviet Union and then Russia. That they can't believe it. The second thing, the reaction is, of course, an acknowledgement by most Europeans that they have failed over the last 3 decades to do what they should do, to be strong militarily, to deter Russia, and to have to perhaps do something without strong American support. That's in the industry side, the nuclear deterrence. They were very late in cutting their dependence on Russian oil, which made them very vulnerable, of course. And then the third thing I would say is Europe is probably going to be forced into doing something they've talked about, which is to accept more responsibility, this sovereignty, if you will. And in the long run, I think we in the United States are going to regret that Europe will not be as dependent on us. It's going to hurt us economically as well as in a security standpoint.
And General, to follow up on the difference between Europe and the U.S. here when it comes to Ukraine now under Donald Trump, the president is now skipping over the step of obtaining a ceasefire before actually reaching a peace deal that would last. The Europeans have pushed for a ceasefire first. What is the significance of skipping over this step? How are we to read it, and who does it favor?
Well, I think it favors the Russians. The fact is, nobody in Europe, and probably most serious people in the United States, know that Russia cannot be trusted to live up to any agreement, let alone a ceasefire. To have an effective ceasefire, there has to be some kind of enforcement mechanism. And so here is where I think Europe could convey to the President of the United States that if the U.S. would call for this and the U.S. would help with some things such as intelligence and maybe logistics, that the Europeans would shoulder the burden for enforcing a ceasefire. But instead, they have agreed or given in to Putin's demand that no NATO troops of any type can be on the ground in Ukraine. That's not a decision for the Kremlin to make, but that's how we are acting, as if they do have that right to make that demand. I think that the idea of going straight to some kind of a peace settlement, the danger is that, again, nobody trusts the Russians. There's no record of Russia living up to any agreement unless they were forced to do it. And so I think this is why, and even Secretary Rubio, up until just a few weeks ago, he talked consistently about the need for a ceasefire to stop the killing, but also to build trust and confidence that Russia would actually live up to an agreement. Look at what Russia did last night. They killed another 7 Ukrainian civilians with incendiary bombs dropped on top of an apartment building. The night before, this meeting is supposed to happen. And then you've got Russian bombers flying out in the Barents Sea close to Alaska. These are not signs of a Russian government that is really, really wanting to have a negotiated settlement that's acceptable to all.
Right. And General, I'm glad that you brought up Secretary of State Marco Rubio, because he actually did say in one of his interviews over the weekend that one of the issues with a ceasefire is that you have to enforce it. And perhaps that's starting to be some of the messaging that we've seen out of the White House. And another area where the Secretary of State was pressed on, President Trump was pressed on in the Oval Office, is exactly what those security guarantees are going to look like if they do move to a peace deal. And I would love to get your thoughts here on exactly what the Europeans are going to be pushing for, because we have seen a range of options perhaps floated on the table, such as the UK and France earlier this year proposing a plan that would see reassurance forces, air cover, things like that. What, in your view, is realistic? And what do you expect our allies to really be pushing for that they think they could get when it comes to guarantees from the United States?
Well, if I may, of course, Secretary Rubio was correct to say that a ceasefire would require enforcement, but so would a peace settlement. I mean, there is nobody in Europe trusts Russia to do what they say they'll do unless they're forced to. So whether we go to ceasefire or go directly to some sort of an agreement, does anybody seriously believe that Russia will live up to it? There's no record of them doing that anywhere. But let's go to the point of your question of what would a enforcement or what would security guarantees look like. Obviously, I'll say what many have said is that NATO is the best security guarantee. These things that Mr. Witkoff has said about a NATO-like or a NATO-style guarantee, what a meaningless statement. I mean, what does he mean by NATO-like? That means an attack on Ukraine would be considered like an attack on the U.S.